few weeks ago, there was a video released by a guy named Christian Hines called Frieren and the Politics of Deception, and I think this video perfectly demonstrates the false premises that the right wing have adopted en masse, and how that leads to their movement declining into crippling impotence as the leftist destroyers eventually overpower them for the trillionth time. Despite this glaring issue, however, they still ironically chastise us for bringing this issue forward by calling us quote-unquote idealists, or too married to abstract theory, or just not living in reality. Or if we actually translate what they are saying, is that we must abandon our principles and adopt the pragmatist strategy. They say that our attachment to these ideals will not secure us any political victories. Our opposition are violent madmen who use our morality against us, and due to this we should be pragmatic and respond to their attacks by any means necessary. This, however, is completely incorrect, and I will demonstrate this by using this video by Hines as an example. Before I begin, however, I will only be addressing the contentions I have with his arguments, because even though I don't think he is fully incorrect here, and in a lot of ways I actually agree with him, I just think the incorrect points are far more important to address. So anyway, let's begin. I'll try to show the clip in its entirety, but I've made a few cuts here and there to save time, so if you want to see the original context, I 100% recommend you watching the original video.
And in one of the most memorable scenes of the first season, Frieren's party encounters a demon that has taken the form of a young girl. The human hero of this party, Himmel, simply can't bring himself to strike this demon down, even after it had just murdered and eaten another child. From Himmel's perspective, all that he sees is a small and frightened girl, not a monster with no compassion for its victims. And so he just can't do it. He can't swing his sword and strike this demon down, because it goes against his own principles, his own moral compass, really his entire worldview. What happens next is that the village chieftain steps forward and offers to take the demon in as one of his own. He basically promises to raise it as a human and to show it love and compassion. But in doing so, he's playing right into the demon's hands. It has no interest in integrating into human society or reforming itself along humanity's moral order. All it's interested in is manipulating the emotions and principles of the humans around it in order to continue killing. And so, tragically, the same principles that drove this family to open up their home ultimately result in the village chieftain being killed. Finally, Frieren steps forward to do what Himmel couldn't. The demon cries out yet again for a mother it doesn't even have. And when Frieren presses it on it, it finally admits that it's simply a magic word that keeps people from killing them. The point here is that demons use human empathy and morality to their own advantage, despite never adhering to those moral principles themselves. This is why I said earlier that Frieren is deeply right-wing, so much so that there's an entire collection of memes pointing this fact out. I've summarized the phenomenon here, in a tweet that ultimately inspired this entire video. This has been the story of American politics for years. The Constitution, the rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, the founders' vision for this entire country. All of these things are generational commitments on the right. We see them as essential elements to who we are as Americans. They have to be honored and defended, even when doing so is painful, and even when honoring them means sometimes losing. But this is exactly why the left appeals to these things. Even if they don't fully understand the reason why, they do understand that these things carry an almost mythic power in the minds of conservatives. And it's a mythic power they're all too happy to exploit when it suits them. Perhaps there's no better recent example of this than this year's Democrat State of the Union rebuttal. Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger deliberately chose to deliver it from the chamber of North America's oldest legislative body in Williamsburg. Explicit references to the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Direct appeals to
what our founders envisioned.
Spanberger even went so far as to quote George Washington and regurgitate the old conservative adage about law and order, yet somehow twist it into an attack on ICE, even after an illegal migrant from Sierra Leone with 30 prior arrests stabbed a woman at a bus stop in Northern Virginia. Keep in mind, all of this was happening at the same time the Democratic Party in the state she governs is advancing bills to terminate Virginia's cooperation agreements with ICE, limit the ability of law enforcement to share information with federal immigration agents, ban immigration arrests near courthouses, and turn schools into ICE-free zones. And the same illegal alien who stabbed a woman to death at a bus stop in Northern Virginia, that all happened literally the day before her speech. Does she believe this is what the founders would have wanted? Illegal migrants from another continent coming here and killing Americans? The answer, of course, is that she isn't confused, and she's not being inconsistent. She knows exactly what she's doing. She's invoking the things she knows conservatives hold sacred, because invoking them constrains conservative action.
Yes, leftists are rather similar to the demons in Frieren because they only wear the skin of our values when it is convenient to their goals. But here's the thing. Notice how I said wear the skin and not work within. That is a very important distinction because fundamentally what the leftists are doing is not actually working within the laws of the founding principles at all, but through them gaining the ability to morph the principles as they see fit. Hines is trying to say that our principles are making us impotent against the leftist threat, but the situation he has described doesn't demonstrate in any meaningful way how specifically our principles can very easily address the situation without resorting to pragmatism. Let's look at the comparison first. Hines very clearly presents Himmel as the cucked right-winger who is just too weak to violate their principles against the immediate threat, which are the demon leftist destroyers, and Frieren is presented as the pragmatist Ubermensch willing to wield state power to crush the problem through brute force, or in this case with ice. The problem with this, however, is that the actual reason Himmel doesn't violate his principles is due to his lack of understanding of how demons function. He falsely believes that this child is capable of being redeemed through kindness. However, The demons are physically incapable of being peaceful. Their nature requires human suffering and constant deceit. They will never change, something the demon blatantly admits to as Frieren finally deals with it. If Himmel or the Elder were aware of said fact beforehand, they would not hesitate to remove the threat because clearly nurturing it is totally futile. And what I'm trying to say here with this is that Himmel saving the demon had nothing to do with his naive principles holding him back, as Hines falsely assumes, but him simply being ignorant of the facts at hand. So, knowing that this is a false comparison, this actually further debunks the initial argument, because indeed, any issue can be resolved through principled means, and Hines presenting pragmatism as the only solution is a blatant false alternative. In the case of the show, the answer is pretty damn obvious. According to our clearly Himmel's principles, Frieren getting rid of the demon is the moral choice. The demon is by nature a natural outlaw that should be dealt with. But as we stated before, they initially made the incorrect call due to a false premise that demons can actually be redeemed. And funnily enough, the exact same issue actually provides a counter against Hines in regards to his point of illegal immigration. How so? Well, it's rather simple. The example he brings up, specifically the fact that illegal immigrants are prone to violence, doesn't actually provide a sound argument for why ICE is the best solution here, and this is due to him, similar to Himmel, not grasping the facts at hand. Let's first address the obvious point. I think Hines, or basically anyone who is even remotely honest in this discussion, would admit that the legal status of the immigrant is completely irrelevant to this conversation. Even ICE agents use the justification that these immigrants are violent, degenerate criminals and taxpayer parasites, rather than trying to appeal to the law. Of course, some attempt to rely on the Mott and Bailey that they are illegal, but are fairly dismissed due to legal positivism being obviously retarded. So the argument Hines puts forward is, in my opinion, far more important and interesting. So yes, illegal immigrants to the West absolutely do get away with an obscene amount of crime, especially property crimes and brutal violence. But what is this actually due to? Is it the fact that immigrants can easily cross European and American borders? Or is clearly something else going on here? Well, as Hines accidentally alludes to, it is actually because of the courts and the legal system at large being taken over by subhuman egalitarian neo-Marxists. People who fundamentally view crime not in the form of aggression or force, but as class conflict. To them, the class that is most well off is always exploiting the lower class, so the lower class can do anything they want since they are being oppressed by them. Or to translate this in normal people speak, this means the illegal Somalian has all the right to rape, steal, murder, or pillage whatever the hell he wants from the place he immigrates to, or more specifically the oppressor Western countries. Because of his oppressed status, this gives him the moral claim and entitlement to the bodies and resources of the exploiter class within the West. And due to this egalitarian nonsense taking over Western courts, this leads to people who are considered to be the oppressor or lower class not be punished for their crimes and be given the ability to be, as I like to call it, the permanent destroyer class, who basically have legal immunity to endlessly rape the productive members of society, as the psychopathic judges let this slide because of my socioeconomic status or my prejudice plus power or whatever bullshit. Not to mention, easily the biggest reason the immigrants even come here in the first place is due to the state giving them massive amounts of petty subsidies and beefy welfare programs, which gives them all the reason to refuse to civilize and produce, and instead end up becoming mindless destroyers of the productive men in society and acting as degenerate hedonist slaves. And the productive class are completely powerless to do anything about this. If they try to defend themselves, the state will punish them severely, and if they preemptively exclude these people from their property, they will be sued to an oblivion due to civil rights laws making it downright illegal to have freedom of association. So what is the problem I have very clearly demonstrated? Well, the issue is very obviously not the fact that the borders are open to access. The issue is the government actively disallowing the productive members of Western society to deal with these degenerate people. The state actively aids them to continue committing their crimes and disallows us from defending ourselves. And something that Hines for some reason doesn't understand is that this root issue can absolutely be resolved without the use of massive amounts of government overreach. And ICE does not even come close to addressing the core issue causing these people to be unproductive. And before you people start typing in the comments, I'm completely willing to admit that illegal immigrants, especially from shithole nations, are far more likely to be violent and degenerate criminals due to their incompatible cultures and ideologies. I am not denying the objective fact that these people are per capita more violent than the native population, and it has nothing to do with oppressive hierarchies or white supremacy or whatever. And fundamentally, these people are more likely to see us as subhuman rape cattle and our culture something to be replaced and spat upon. But, and this is a big but, This doesn't give us any rational justification for why punishing all of them collectively due to the crimes of the majority is the best solution in this case. This is because illegal immigrants are not, by their nature, violent or aggressive. They are more likely to engage in those actions, sure, but they aren't destined to be that way. Racial determinism is simply not a real thing. Indeed, these immigrants might have a biological tendency to be less compatible with Western society, but those instincts can be overcome due to the fact that humans have a rational faculty. Unlike the demons in Frieren, who are basically just irrational animals whose entire existence is to feast upon humans, illegal immigrants are simply irrational by choice. A lot of them refuse to evolve past the stage of being violent madmen out of either pure laziness or just evasion of reality. So they adopt evil and incoherent ideologies which lead them to be permanent underclassmen in any civilized society they try to enter. But how about illegal immigrants who aren't like these parasitic degenerates? Why should these people be violently punished by the state for committing the crime of being vaguely associated with these brutish individuals? How does sending these people to some shithole sandpit where there is no place for them to utilize their more civilized nature actually solve the issue Hines presented, that the unproductive masses are allowed by the state to commit and recommit aggression against peaceful citizens? Deporting all these people for simply being illegal immigrants is like putting a band-aid on a phantom limb. You have not gotten rid of the egalitarian courts and the welfare system, which allow these people to thrive in the first place. All you have done with this is commencing massive amounts of state militarization, giving ample opportunity for the leftist destroyers, whose foundations are completely unaffected by the pragmatist policy, who will eventually counter-assault you 20 times over, like during the COVID lockdowns. So if the pragmatist solution is an obvious false alternative, what is the principled solution to this problem? Well, it's quite simple really. In the case of the repeating offender being allowed to jihad once again, if the judges are just simply allowing him to get away with it again, just get rid of the judges. If the state can't do it, we can just Hoppe-style physically remove them from life, or estoppel their asses with 2 bulls so they could get raped to death. Basically anything works, as long as we do it. And same in the case of the violent criminal. If they get a lighter sentence, again, remove that person. We don't even need to imagine this scenario playing out that much. It has literally happened in the US before. For example, Leo Frank, who was a businessman who raped and murdered a 13-year-old girl, was about to be given a lighter sentence for his crime until a bunch of Aryan militiamen dragged him out and physically removed his circular vertebrae with a rope. Same with the welfare system and voting. Just don't allow illegal immigrants, including multiple generation ones, to gain access to those services. And in regards to the Civil Rights Act, before people saw it as a necessary thing to create the act due to Jim Crow existing, before this nonsense, Americans already had the right to associate with whoever they wanted. So, just simply repeal the Civil Rights Act. You people may argue that, well, you can't actually do that in the current legal system. But that is exactly the fucking problem here. Hines is trying to reframe the principle in a way where he just pretends like it is already being attempted and it just isn't working anymore, while he is also equivocating between the current neoliberal status quo with the original founding principles of the US. Even though the United States has very clearly began slowly abandoning those principles over time, something Hines himself very clearly seems to understand. So why is he not advocating for the original principles if it so obviously had the answers to these problems? Why is he deliberately framing it in a way to make the principles seem useless against an issue it had ample ability to deal with, as I have clearly demonstrated? Well, this is when we get into what he says afterwards, which is easily the most nonsensical and blatantly Hegelian retardation I've ever heard in my entire life. Said by a guy who supposedly isn't a fucking communist, by the way. Roll the clip.
So what does this all teach us? Well, for years now, the left has spent a long time essentially abusing deeply held conservative principles in order to force them into situations that actively harms them. And they've just expected to keep getting away with this as long as they can string together the right magic word. That's precisely what the demon does in Frieren. It doesn't need to overpower Himmel. It just needs him to hesitate and to doubt whether he's looking at an enemy at all. But this spell only has power over someone who believes in it. And this is what the right has been painfully slow to come to terms with. The Constitution, the rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, the founders' vision for America. None of these things came first. The revolution did. The rules and procedures only came after the question was settled as to who this country belonged to and what overarching vision would govern it. Right now, there's a new battle being waged over those first order questions. And recognizing this isn't an act of cynicism or an abandonment alignment of principle. To go back to the Frieren analogy for just a moment, when she strikes the demon down, does she somehow stop protecting the humans she cares about? Does she become the demon herself? No, she just stops pretending that extending mercy to something that will use that mercy to keep killing is synonymous with being merciful itself. Ultimately, the right doesn't need to stop believing in the Constitution or the rule of law. It just needs to stop extending these principles in a universal, automatic, and good faith manner to the very forces that have made it clear that they'll invoke them when convenient and discard them when they're not. And doing so isn't a betrayal of what the founders built or stood for. It's actually the only way any of it can possibly survive.
Before we begin unpacking the very blatant contradiction in his argument, let's first address the Frieren comparison once more. Again, he is doing yet another equivocation. The reason Himmel hesitates has absolutely nothing to do with his principles holding him back, but it's because he is incorrectly applying the principle due to him misunderstanding the facts at hand, that this demon is literally incapable of being rational. And as Hines states, yeah, Frieren isn't in the wrong for striking the demon down and protecting the humans around her, but that is due to her correctly applying the principle in that situation. She actually understood what the nature of the demons are and acted accordingly. Hines is trying once again to desperately apply his incoherent narrative to the scene when it is completely irrelevant in a blatant false comparison. But it gets even worse when you realize what his point actually is. He is unironically trying to argue that violating your principles isn't actually violating your principles because you believe in the principle. Yeah, that is a blatant fucking contradiction. Principles are the facts at hand. They are required to analyze if a certain situation is ethical or unethical. You can't just say that in some irrelevant situation those facts are just not facts anymore because we're living in reality. Because fundamentally, a fact at hand can't just change on a whim. If you try to justify violating a principle, then you don't believe that it is a fact of reality. Or, in other words, you abandon it entirely. And I must emphasize that Hines isn't arguing that the principles the conservatives hold are false or anything, and is trying to provide an alternative solution. No, he is trying to argue that their principles are fully correct, but sometimes they are not correct. Which is, again, a very blatant contradiction. And yet again, he doubles down on the false alternative. How can these leftist destroyers be working within the founding principles and using it against us when those principles have almost entirely left the status quo ever since the fucking progressive era of the US? He already understands that the status quo is not following the ideas we hold. They are actively violating it. We can't possibly be forced to hesitate due to our principles, when, as I have clearly demonstrated, that this poison can be very much dealt with through principled means. Again, he just asserts without any real argument or proof that being principled automatically equals being impotent. Not to mention, it is incredibly hypocritical for him to argue that leftists are just using the principle as their personal plaything. Isn't he literally doing the exact same thing by actively advocating the violation of said principles? And it's even more ironic as he refers to leftists as deceitful psychopaths, considering the man whose policies he is actively advocating for has continuously demonstrated to be a blatant liar ever since the start of his fucking campaign. This false dichotomy that Hines tries to present here is essentially the equivalent of heads I win and tails you lose. It's such blatant bullshit, yet absolutely no one in the comments section, besides retarded leftists whose entire argument boils down to incoherent screeching, address these blatant flaws. Because fundamentally, unlike how Hines tries to portray it, the American right wing is completely taken over by pragmatists. This kind of mindset has infected almost every right-wing movement imaginable. Yes, even including libertarianism. They are fixing the coin in a way to justify by any means to abandon those principles. But why? What are they so desperately trying to achieve that abandoning their core ideals is worth it in the end? Well, that is where we get into the reason why the left has so easily, without much resistance, objectively won the culture war. Because the right wing, over time, became entirely reactionary. Not the retarded leftist definition of reactionary, or anyone who's even remotely right if Hassan Piker is actually Adolf Hitler or whatever, but reactionary in a very literal sense. These people do nothing but react to what the left does, seeing how they are destroying basically all the values the right so desperately cares about, and instead of understanding what created those values in the first place, and how to apply those principles in a way to defend them, they instead act out of fear and desperation. They run to anyone who's even vaguely trying to solve the pet issue, and unconditionally support them. They want these leftist destroyers gone by any means necessary, even if it means abandoning their own principles, which they oh so desperately care about apparently. This kind of reactionary response, however, leads to them making irrational decisions that don't even come close to resolving the core issues. They are focusing on the result of the leftist bad actions, but not the root of those bad actions. In the case of the leftists, it is what they have that the right doesn't, which is a core philosophy, which has totally captured the global intelligentsia, which happened because the right totally abandoned trying to make a rational justification for their principles. That is why they always default to pragmatism. They don't understand the principles well enough to know how to apply them in reality. They understand in some primitive form that these values are true, but they refuse to think further than that. They don't understand that values can't be forced upon people. This Machiavellian statecraft bullshit is totally irrelevant when the state, intelligentsia, the economic contributors, and the average man have at their root an evil leftist philosophy. You can't just start wielding power and expect everyone to go along with you. You must convince them first, which requires having a coherent, principled philosophy. This kind of intrinsicism that the right adopted is what gave the leftists the perfect opportunity to invade the West and replace our values with a disgusting mangled demon. Since the right gave up on explaining why their objectively good values were actually good in the first place, the left looked like the more rational and philosophical ones because they actually attempted to explain their nonsense dribble. So in conclusion, in a weird twist of irony, the example Hines provides is actually in reverse. Himmel is actually the modern right. Incapable of grasping the facts at hand, they incorrectly apply the principle, which leads to stagnation and the leftist invasion. While Frieren is the based principle radical who understands the principle and the facts at hand, so she properly applies her principles to reality, which actually solve the fucking problem. So yeah, even though this video was very critical of Hines and the general right wing, I think it was important to address these issues outside of the very obviously incoherent and irrational leftist lens. I may be harsh in this video, but I want the people who I respect who like the original video I'm referencing to understand these very blatant and fundamental flaws within it. Even though Hines and many right-wingers have very good intentions in my opinion, they have completely incorrect premises which lead them to very flawed and horrible conclusions, which gives the people we so desperately despise the ammunition to destroy us all. Anyways, thank you guys for watching.